Evolving Past Alzheimer's podcast, where we are focused on bringing you information to help prevent and reverse brain diseases like Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'm Dr. Nate Bergman, a functional medicine physician in Cleveland, Ohio, and your host on this journey. So, whether you're a baby boomer who's worried that your brain wiring just isn't working like it once was, or you have loved ones with the disease, or you yourself have already been diagnosed and are wondering, what do I do now? You'll want to listen to this podcast. Each episode, we introduce you to the top doers and thinkers that are revisioning Alzheimer's and dementia. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page, or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. So here we go. Let's get better. Welcome back to the show. Accumulation of stress over a lifetime is linked to Alzheimer's disease and other chronic diseases. Our guest today is a fascinating and brilliant guy. His research integrates tools and methods from psychology, neuroscience, immunology, genetics, and genomics to explain the effects of stress on aging, mood, and the brain. He's currently investigating how experiences of social stress and adversity reach deep inside the body to influence the activity of the human genome. Dr. George Slavich holds several titles, including a professorship in psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at UCLA. He is the associate director of the Stress Measurement Network and director of the UCLA Laboratory for Stress Assessment and Research. Welcome to the show, Dr. George Slavich.
Great, Nate. Thanks for having me, and warm welcome to your listeners as well. Thanks so much for having me on.
You're a world traveler. George, you always seem to be somewhere that's not LA. Always seem to be in Europe these days. Where are you right now?
Well, as much as we like to think that stress only happens in America, stress is a universal experience that touches all ends of the globe. And one of the countries in which I have family roots and also now scientific collaborations is Croatia. As many of your listeners will know, Croatia went through a pretty substantial experience of war in the very late 80s and early 90s. And because of that, much of the population either had personal experiences with war or knows somebody else who did. And so this offers us a unique opportunity to try to understand the aftermath, the psychological aftermath of a really potent stressor living in a country that experienced war. So in any case, that's where I am at this exact moment in time, working on some collaborations to try to understand how stress affects diseases of aging in this particular context.
That's so interesting. I remember when I was finishing up my undergrad, because you mentioned war, when I was finishing up my undergrad, I learned about something called Psychoneuroimmunology. Of course, you have deep expertise here. And I was like, hey, I want to do that when I grow up. I mean, I want whatever I do should have some piece that looks at that, but I didn't really understand. I didn't really understand what it was. So I remember I was going back and forth with a researcher that was in the Middle East in sort of in an area that had been through a lot of war. But I concluded at the time, I was finished. It was my last year of undergrad when this happened. It would just take me 7 to 10 years until I could get my hands dirty on this type of sort of subject, really get into it. And I read some stuff in medical school, found some textbooks, and it was like a journal. And can you tell us what exactly is the sort of field of psychoneuroimmunology, and how did you find your way into it?
Sure. I can say that I love the field and I hate the title, because psychoneuroimmunology sounds much more complex than the actual idea is. And it's also not so easy to pronounce. So that's another issue. But in a nutshell, the field of psychoneuroimmunology, which is not a very big field, involves the study of how psychological processes like cognition and emotion, how you think about the world and how you feel, influences the brain. So that's the neurology part of it. And then how the psychology and the neurology combine to influence immunology. And that's how you get psychoneuroimmunology. So an easier way of thinking about it is basically mind-body medicine, which is, of course, very popular and holistic and integrative and functional approaches, but still not, fully appreciated by all Western doctors. And I'll just say one other thing, which is the reason that psychoneuroimmunology is fascinating, I think, is that many doctors in medical school still learn that the immune system is regulated almost entirely internally and by processes that occur below the neck. below the shoulders, really. And so one of the things that psychoneuroimmunology as a field has really done is to help society, to help patient providers, and to help other scientists realize that the immune system is regulated not just by internal processes, but also by the way that we experience the world. And that, I think, is a really fascinating idea, to think that your immune system can be tuned and calibrated and affected by how you feel and what you've experienced in life.
Exactly. So that's so really interesting to hear you articulate it, and relatively simple. You can tell there's a lot underneath there. How did you find your way into this? I know you've had an interesting trajectory in the West Coast and the East Coast and Boston.
I did. I was a psychology undergraduate, fell into it incidentally. I thought that I wanted to study business, but my undergrad college didn't have a business major. And so I got interested in psychology and realized that it was the psychology part of business that sort of interested me. But I did my PhD in clinical psychology, and then I realized that I wasn't really satisfied with the ability for psychology to solve the problems that I wanted solved. So in graduate school, I was trying to understand how the different types of life events that we experience, like divorces, breakups, job loss, and so on, led to some people experiencing depression and other people not. But at that point in time, which was around 2006, 2007, psychology didn't involve a lot of biology. So the problem that we had was we knew that people experienced stressful life events like a breakup, and we knew that they got depressed, but we didn't know how those two things were linked. We didn't really understand how those life events influence the brain or influence the body to bring about this complex disorder that we know as depression. So long story short, I was in Boston at the time working at Harvard-affiliated hospital, which is an excellent place for mental health care, McLean Hospital. And I was reading the work of a psychoneuroimmunologist at UCSF in San Francisco. Her name is Margaret Kemeny, and she has a very long career of doing some fantastic work trying to understand how experiences of social stress influence the immune system. So I fell in love with her work, moved to San Francisco from Boston, and I can say in terms of my history with psychoneuroimmunology, the rest is history. So eventually you made your way into what I understood to be one of your mentors, which was Stephen Cole at UCLA, and kind of got way in some of these really interesting experiments in depression and transcriptomic and things like that, and immune system. Is that right? Yeah, actually, the connection there is that Margaret Kemeny, who I went to work with at UCSF, was also a primary mentor for Steve Cole when they were both at UCLA. And I was looking to stay at UCSF and stay in San Francisco, but unfortunately, that was around the time of the financial crash, and a lot of hospitals were not hiring, freezing hiring, and so on and so forth. So I was sad to leave San Francisco, but took the opportunity to move to UCLA, where I've been now since 2009. And one of my primary collaborators there has been, as you mentioned, Steve Cole. And the focus of our work together has been, I think, really groundbreaking, if I can't say so myself, which is essentially addresses the question of how social experiences that we have in daily life, whether they be relatively minor, like being late or being evaluated, or whether or not they're relatively major, again, like a divorce or losing your job, how it is that those types of adversity can reach deep down inside the body to influence the activity of some of our most basic biological processes, which is the activity of the human genome. And of course, we can talk more about that, as I'm sure we will, since it really provides kind of exciting new ways to understand exactly how diseases of aging develop over time.
So what are some of the interesting things and the techniques you've used even sort of elucidate diseases of aging vis-a-vis this sort of stress phenomenon?
So the first thing to know is that in daily life, we experience the human genome as being relatively stable across the different situations that we experience and across time. So, we all learn that you get half of your genetic code from your mother and you get half of your genetic code from your father. And for the most part, you can't experience changes in your human genome from time to time throughout the day. So it makes sense that we experience our genome as being stable across time. But one of the key landmark findings in this area of research that we've now called human social genomics is the finding that the human genome is not stable across time and across situations, but it actually changes fairly dramatically depending on how we're feeling and what we're thinking at any given moment in time.
So just to clarify, the genes change or the expression of those genes change?
Aha, great question. So the genes themselves are relatively stable, but genes can be turned on and turned off. And genes, for the most part, don't affect disease risk unless those genes are turned on and they're doing something. So what human social genomics is particularly interested in is not in the genes themselves so much as in the changing activity of those genes in response to different social and environmental circumstances.
So what kind of things do you measure? Like, how do you measure that?
We can look at levels of mRNA that get produced when genes are turned on, and that gives us a signal of the extent to which those genes are producing something that can lead to the production of proteins. And it's those proteins, of course, that get released into circulation and then affect cognition and emotion and disease risk. Perhaps most fascinating is that we have 25,000 or so genes in the human genome. Because of that, you have lots and lots of different things that can be turned on or turned off at any moment in time. I think what's fascinating about some of the work that we've done in human social genomics is that using a complex procedure called Microarraybased genome-wide transcriptional profiling, that's the official term of it, but what we can think of it is as a panoramic photograph of the activity of your genes across all 25,000 or so genes at any moment in time. So using this kind of panoramic camera, we can take a photograph of the activity of all of your genes in the human genome at one point in time, and take another photograph of the activity of your entire human genome at a second point in time. And then we can ask the question across all of the genes in the human genome, how did their activity change over time? And I say that loosely because you can do this longitudinally. For example, you could take this panoramic photograph when people are 40 years old, 50 years old, and 60 years old. And then you could look at how the activity across the entire human genome changes as individuals age. But the other thing that we really learned is that the activity of the human genome changes very quickly, even in a matter of 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 minutes. So this type of panoramic photograph can also be taken when individuals come into a laboratory, for example, for a stress study. You can take this photograph at baseline before they find out that they're going to be stressed, and you can take that same photograph 5, 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later, or 30 minutes later, and see how the activity of the human genome changes in the laboratory, even as a result of relatively short experiences of stress.
So you're basically measuring gene production products and then sort of a larger swath of genetic expression that you mentioned, sort of like taking pictures along the way. Now, in a lab, so you could take somebody into a lab and dip their hand in cold water and have them do math and, I guess sort of give them mild experience of stress and take these types of pictures. How do we know if those types of changes equate to somebody that has had been mugged or been attacked or, gone through another, what we would consider a significant, short-lasting stressor in their life?
That's a great question. And the first question you might ask along those lines is, what kind of genes are changing in their activity? I mean, if we have 25,000 or so genes, is it just any random set of genes, or is it some specific set of genes? And in a lot of the studies that we've done along with Steve Cole, we found that it's not just any random set of genes that changes in response to stress, but it's genes specifically that are involved in the innate immune system, either in the initiation of an innate immune system response called the acute phase response, which essentially increases levels of inflammation throughout the body and decreases your antiviral response. And we've found this pattern of increased activity of innate immune response genes and decreased activity of antiviral genes both in the laboratory in response to social evaluation or social rejection. But we've also done these studies in, let's say, real life with individuals who experienced major social rejection life events. And what's fascinating to me is we see a very similar pattern of genomic response. That is, an increase in activity of genes that are involved in promoting inflammation and a reduction in activity of genes that are involved in antiviral response. And we can talk about kind of what we think is the function of that. The truth is that we don't know for sure. We just have some hypotheses about why that may be occurring.
Why do you think that's occurring?
So inflammation we typically think of is as the body's primary response to physical injury to the body. So I'm sure many of your listeners have cut their arm or at one point in time, and around that cut, they might notice a little bit of redness, some swelling. It might get a little bit warm. And essentially, that's the body's way of fighting off infection and any pathogens or bacteria that might be introduced into the womb during physical injury. So the first thing to know is that a strong inflammatory response to some kind of physical injury is really critical for survival. The second thing to know is that response during physical injury is critical, but what we think might be an even more effective response is an inflammatory response that occurs in advance of somebody actually being physically injured. And the reason for that is that immune cells are hanging out in different compartments of the body, like in your tummy fat and in bone marrow. And in order for those immune cells to effectively reduce the risk for infection, those immune cells have to be not in those locations where they're hanging out, but they have to be distributed all throughout the body. And long story short, what we think might have happened over the course of evolution is we think the brain and the immune system may have gained the ability to scan the social environment for situations where physical danger may have been more likely to occur. And now, of course, your listeners are probably thinking about different situations where physical danger might have been more likely to occur. And they're probably right in terms of the things that they're thinking about, situations that involve social conflict or social rejection, or situations where you're socially isolated from your herd and you don't have the same protection. So again, we don't know for sure, but the idea is that perhaps the brain and the immune system are responding to cues in the social environment that have historically represented an increased risk for physical danger, because that allows the immune system to respond in advance of physical injury actually occurring.
So if somebody's thinking about something, in other words, they're visualizing something terrible, a major stressor, do you see the same genetic expression, if you will? Do you see these same sort of gene products being produced as if somebody has actually experienced it?
Yeah, that's a great question. The ability to imagine social interactions and to plan for the future is exactly what makes humans uniquely. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, if it's Monday now and we have an interaction with our boss on Friday, our ability to imagine how that interaction is going to go, to understand the nature of our social relationship, and to plan for the future is exactly what gives our society the collective social network that we have. We're uniquely social beings in that way. Of course, the downside is that it is exactly what you said, that we can conjure up social interactions in our mind that become just as vivid as an actual social interaction that would occur in real time. And either fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you think about it, the purely imagining these types of negative social interactions is sufficient for triggering the type of immune response that would happen if you're actually in that situation.
So this is actually reminding me of some of the topics when I would read about them originally got me engaged in this concept of what at the time I was calling Psychoneuroimmunology, which is this idea of visualization, etc. And if we know, can we conclude, George, if you can turn on this negative set of inflammation and decreased immune system function if somebody has actually experienced stress or is even imagining themselves to be under stress. The opposite is true. There's been a lot of interest in the idea of resilience. I know you've started to write on this concept of resilience, meaning what works for people, what are the common denominators genetically, genomically, in terms of genetic expression of people that are resilient, that are not having issues or are overcoming things or have been through stressors and are succeeding. And maybe that's part of the work that you're doing now in Europe. But the idea of, essentially positive psychology, power of positive thinking, do we see that playing out in your research too, in terms of genetic expression? Do you see patterns that are associated with health and wellness and resilience?
Yeah, I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of this double-edged sword. I mean, a lot of people, it's easy to say that, okay, if you're having negative thoughts and emotions, that's going to lead to an increase in inflammatory activity. And isn't that terrible? That means that if I'm having a bad day, even if nothing is actually going on, then I could be increasing levels of inflammation throughout my body. And if I did that on a daily basis or on a weekly basis, I could be causing real damage or harm to my body without really even knowing it. But I like to think of that as being the real silver lining in all of these dynamics that we're learning about. In other words, if it's the case that the way that you think about the world can increase inflammation, then it's also true that the way that you think about the world can decrease inflammation. And it can also decrease your inflammatory response to any kind of social stressor that you're experiencing. And the easiest way that I have found to think about that is to remember that your immune system can't be directly affected by some type of experience that's happening in the social world. All of those experiences in the social world have to go through your brain in order to affect your immune system. So in that case, the way that you think about the world, whether you think about social interactions as being negative versus positive, or if you think about social relationships as being helpful versus harmful, that means that you essentially have the power to influence the activity of your immune system at the level of proteins and the level of genes, presumably by altering how you think about the social environment. And I think that's a powerful idea. And maybe not everybody wants that type of responsibility, because then you realize that to some degree you do carry the responsibility of your health in your own hands. But that's essentially what we're learning, that people have a great ability to affect the activity of the immune system by changing the way that they think about the environment.
And those things are measured. Are you doing the positive correlations as well? So the negative correlation as well. Somebody had an experience of stress or of trauma or something like that. You can see the negative correlations. Has anybody measuring the positive correlations at this point in a way that's fairly convincing and fairly clear and sort of reproducible by other researchers?
Yeah, we had a paper, for example, 3 years ago. We examined the entire literature linking yoga meditation with different markers of immune system activity and markers of aging. We examined 20 randomized control trials that used some meditation practice and that also measured levels of inflammation in the blood or other markers of diseases of aging. And let's say the field is not entirely consistent, partly because there are just not enough studies done to date yet. But I would say that there is pretty promising evidence that, at least among the studies that are well done, that yoga meditation can lessen the activity of mechanisms that are involved in inflammation and aging. And there are essentially three kind of categories of interventions now that have shown some promising effects. Again, I want to caution your listeners, because not all of this work is not well done and there are a lot of gaps and holes. But the types of interventions that have proven most effective so far is cognitive behavioral therapy, which some of your listeners might be aware of from the psychology literature, and yoga meditation and mindfulness-based stress reduction. So yoga meditation, CBT, and mindfulness-based stress reduction, there's some evidence that those three types or forms of interventions can have beneficial effects.
Well, what about, I guess it's sort of a similar question, which is histories of trauma. Again, if somebody was attacked or somebody had, as a child, had something terrible happen to them, and we've talked about this with other people, on other guests on the show, it's one thing, right? And what I think a lot of us view as sort of the malady of our 21st century lives and late 20th century lives are chronic stressors. And we don't have to worry about the saber-toothed tiger and for the most of us don't have to worry about where we're going to get our next meal from. But it's all these like little things, whether we've either chosen to worry about them or we have to worry about them, or it's this sort of chronic stress and inflammation. Is there a distinction that you guys have seen between doing the studies on somebody where you're actually stressing them in the lab versus long periods of stress, if you will?
Yeah. So the way that we think about it is that stress, of course, can be acute or can be chronic, like you mentioned. So an acute stressor might be having a really negative interaction with your boss for 1 hour, whereas a chronic stressor might, be a situation where maybe you're in an abusive relationship or maybe you have financial problems.
You have to work nights. You have to work overnight or something like that, just
working nights. Yeah, exactly. Having a difficult work environment, something like that. And the chronic stressors usually do affect immune system function and have high risk for leading to diseases of aging among people who are vulnerable. But acute stressors can also have quite a profound impact on the effects on the immune system if individuals respond to acute stressors in the same way every time they come up. So a great example might be, you're again coming back to the boss example. If you have a boss who's not particularly pleasant to work with, you might have person A who has an unpleasant boss but doesn't think about it very often and therefore doesn't engage their negative thinking styles, don't become engaged, and therefore they're not upregulating their immune system. Whereas you might have person B who has that same exact boss but who is kind of thinking about it constantly. Now you have to ask the question, well, is that kind of an acute stressor or a chronic stressor? We would call that probably, if we're talking about specific interactions, we would call those interactions acute stressors.
But ruminating would be like chronic, right? If you week after week and you're thinking about it, you're taking it home and
Exactly. And just for technical terms, we still wouldn't call the rumination a chronic stressor because we try to refer to stressors as situations that are actually present in the external environment. But what happens is that the way that we think about the world has the ability to turn an acute stressor such that it has chronic lasting effects. And that's exactly what you mentioned, perseveration about things that might happen in the future or rumination about things that might happen in the past. You can take different types of acute stress and you can give them the ability to look like chronic stressors because you're thinking about them constantly and you're totally engaged in those stressors, even if you're not in that situation in the moment.
So let me share with you, and for some transparency for our listeners, I want to share some things about just my clinical practice and regarding Alzheimer's that you've written and others have written, cited literature that chronic stress increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease, particularly in those that are genetically susceptible. And then there's this whole area of people that we don't even know about. And we can probably wax eloquent on the mechanisms there. But you have created a tool called the strain tool. And I want to get into that pretty heavily because what I see in my clinic, and we haven't sort of systematically studied this yet, this is just something I'm observing, is that people have this sort of unquantified, unmeasured amount of stress in life. I'm talking for the most part, middle class, upper middle class, upper class, socioeconomic upper class folks. And they'll come in with Alzheimer's like in their 50s. And this is not just a couple people. This point's probably over 10, 12 people I've seen now. Many of them have undiagnosed sleep apnea. I have no idea why that is yet. And many of them have, I have some ideas of why, but I don't have real clear thinking as to why that is. And then many of them have their illness, the beginning of when they're, the family member or loved one or whoever is bringing them in to see us will describe a period of fairly high stress. These are usually job stresses. Like a partner, like a business partner left them, or they were being acquired financially, there was a part of a merger and acquisition, or like a major relationships stress. Somebody passed away, somebody was getting married, and it wasn't, it was a finance. But there's like a very clear, what I would define as more of a subacute, meaning something that wasn't a one-off event, but it wasn't going on for years. It's usually weeks to months. And it's during that period of time that something is severed and they have developed cognitive impairment. And I've seen this now enough times that I like to explore it more. And you have created this tool. And again, full transparency for our audience and listeners. I am working actively on getting your strain tool into our clinic, but you have created a tool. My sort of overly simplistic understanding of this is that this is a way to quantify a lifetime of stress. But can you tell us a little bit about this tool that you've created called Strain that's doing this job of precisely measuring stress over lifetime and how you sort of intend it to be used?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I'm glad that you brought that up because I think this is something that can also be very useful for your listeners right now as well. The truth about stress is that everybody talks about stress and nobody assesses it. I've talked to breast cancer docs, ovarian cancer docs, cardiovascular docs, psychiatrists, psychologists. The truth is that if you ask them, do your patients suffer from stress? Do they complain about stress? They'll all say yes. It's the first thing. IVF clinics and so on and so forth. Patients as a population know that stress is a big part of their life, and they have some sense that during times of stress, their mental and physical health has been worse. And when they haven't been stressed, they generally feel better. So the funny thing about all this is that patients know that stress impacts their life, and doctors know that stress impacts their patient's life and their own life, by the way. Job burnout in the medical profession is very high. So everybody knows that stress is hugely impactful, and nobody assesses it. So just think back.
Nobody has the tools. How do you do it? You feel stressed. We just, we don't really have tools. There's not these robust tools, I don't think. You know what I mean?
Well, just think about the last time you went to go see your primary care physician and you complained about feeling tired and fatigued and so on. And maybe you even said the word stress to your primary care physician. And when's the last time that somebody's actually interviewed you about specific types of life stressors that you've experienced? No, it absolutely never happens. They may do a blood draw, they may take your weight, they'll see how tall you are, so on and so forth, but they don't assess the presenting problem, which stress is almost always a part of. So long story short, we know that the brain and the immune system one of their jobs is to calibrate themselves to the external social and physical environment. So back to what we were saying earlier, if you were in a social situation, let's say, early on when you were 5 or 10 or 15 years old, maybe you were in a household with parents who were arguing all the time, or maybe you were in a neighborhood that was otherwise dangerous. And in other words, maybe you were in a social environmental circumstance that was not very pleasant, that had some social threat associated with it. The best thing that your brain and your body can do is to try to make sense of the fact that the world is kind of dangerous and try to calibrate itself so that it's best prepared to deal with actual social and physical threats when they occur. But in order to really understand everything that somebody has experienced over the life course, you need to have a tool that gives you a panoramic snapshot of all of the major things that people have experienced. And as you can imagine, that's not exactly easy to do because you're covering many years of a person's life. But that's exactly what we've tried to solve with the stress and adversity inventory.
That's what STRAIN stands for, stress and adversity inventory.
That's right. And essentially, the way that your listeners can think about it is that you sit down at your computer, you log into a website. It takes about 20 minutes to 25 minutes. You answer a handful of questions about your early life experiences, your adulthood experiences. It focuses on different life domains like health, education, work, relationships, maybe some experiences of crime, etc. And after about 20 to 25 minutes, the interview is done. And if your patients are taking this or any of your listeners are taking this, when they're finished with the interview, they'll receive their lifetime stress exposure scores right there on the screen in front of them. So they can see very quickly what it is that they've experienced and in which domains.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, and I've done one on myself. It really is. It's like fascinating. I have joked before where we say, the Eskimos have like 20 words for snow, right? And in the United States, we should probably have 20 words for stress. The family stress, and children, and marriage, and this, and work, and and all the different type of qualitative stressors that we have, and that's what you do. That's how it's sort of split up. It's split up into kind of like domains of different types of stressors.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that we do that, not just for scientific reasons, we do it scientifically because we want to know what kinds of stress are most impactful. But we also think that it's very important for patients and for healthcare providers to know which areas of life should be targeted. You're exactly right that just like snow, there's many different varieties of stress, and you can experience stress at work and you can experience stress in your interpersonal relationships. And in order to make sensible modifications to your life, in order to reduce stress and improve your human health and well-being, you need to know exactly what areas of your life to target to create a maximal impact. And that's exactly why the strain assesses all of these different life domains so that you and your healthcare provider know exactly which domains to target to have maximal impact on your health.
So just to play this out a little bit with using the strain tool, for example, right? So you can take this assessment on yourself and you say, well, I see my social interactions, are the kind of biggest area that's red flagged on the strain tool. And so you say, okay, well, then you can either devise a strategy yourself or in conjunction with a social worker, therapist, et cetera, kind of a working plan, either to change how or adapt how you or I feel about it, sort of hearkening back to earlier in our conversation about sort of how we think about or how we experience the so-called stressor or the external demand that's required us to adapt. Or we could come up with a plan to address sort of actions. And maybe the best plan, it deals with multiple levels, sort of a multi-layered approach. Something like CBT plus cognitive behavioral therapy plus yoga and meditation plus making sure you go out with your friends twice a week or have somebody over once, that type of thing. I guess, and that's sort of in the here and now that it's already ready for prime time. What about the idea of using this tool, the stress inventory, as a predictive piece? Meaning, are you ready yet? I know we don't have studies, but are you ready to sort of speculate saying, well, what if I had my 23andMe results? And I know I have, and let's say, in our case, a copy of an ApoE4 allele. You have a high-risk Alzheimer's gene, one or two. You have one copy or both copies. And I know I have, I did something on some website, and they tell me that my detoxification genetics are somewhat abnormal. They're, 20, 30% different than the rest of the population, the average population. And where you find some things, have you had anybody sort of trying to use this in the biohacker community, as it were, or something like that, where they're using their own genetics and in conjunction with your strain tool to sort of concoct a plan that might be one step more sophisticated than CBT and meditation? Or is it just, eating healthy and yoga and meditation is good for everybody? So is there any extra sophistication that the strain tool can bring us to in terms of prediction and focus other than, okay, I know that work stress is high or my social stress is high?
That's kind of the moonshot idea, is to develop the strain to put it in a position where it can be helpful for exactly what you're talking about. I mean, the formal term for that would be, some of your listeners might be aware of the areas of precision health or precision medicine, which is exactly what you're talking about, the tailoring of healthcare treatment plans for that specific individual. And that is a very ambitious thing that a lot of university and hospital clinics are taking on. And we're not there quite yet with the strain, but we do have the strain in almost 100 different studies so far. And those studies are in almost any major chronic disease or disease of aging that you can think of. So breast cancer, ovarian cancer, lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, depression, anxiety, PTSD, Alzheimer's disease, and cognitive decline and healthy aging even. And what we find is that we can use the strain to predict risk for key biological and clinical outcomes, regardless of which disease model you're talking about. So since your listeners are most interested in sort of biological aging and cognitive decline, for example, they might be interested to know that we can use the strain to predict levels of cognitive function and also levels of changing in biological aging over the course of 1 to 2 years. We don't have a study particularly in Alzheimer's disease yet, but we have a lot of data on cognitive function and cognitive aging, on memory problems, for example, and executive function. And the strain performs very, very well in predicting risk in all of those different cognitive domains.
So that's really interesting. Can you say a little bit more about that in terms of predicting risk and timing? I mean, what are you finding with cognitive decline? I mean, specifically, what have you studied and what have you found?
Sure, we can use executive function as one example. Executive function is sounds like a complex or maybe scary word, but executive function is essentially the extent to which your brain can kind of regulate itself, the extent to which you can plan for the future. Executive function is also involved in emotion regulation. So people who have better executive function during times of stress don't become as upset, or they're upset for less periods of time. Executive function is also useful, as I mentioned, for planning for the future. So better executive function is associated with doing better in school, with having better outcomes at work, and so on and so forth. Executive function is one of those cognitive functions that has far-reaching implications for lots of different areas of people's life. And you can assess executive function using some computer tasks that give a very clear and unbiased readout of the extent to which somebody has good executive function versus executive function that's not working optimally. And so to the extent to which executive function is really useful for your social and emotional well-being, then you want to know, to what extent are you sort of at risk for experiencing problems in executive function. And what we've shown with the strain, for example, is that individuals who have a lot of lifetime stress exposure are at much higher risk for having problems in executive function than are individuals who don't have as much lifetime stress exposure. So, just as in the case where you might have specific genes that are involved in influencing executive function as well, using data from the strains, so too can we see that life experiences hugely impact cognitive function in the domains of executive function and memory and so on.
So do you have any data yet on timing? I mean, if those stresses took place in the first 18 years of somebody's life, for instance, is that different than if it happened, they had a series of significant stressors in their mid-30s versus if they had a series of stressors shortly before the time of their getting ill, let's say with cognitive impairment? Is your stuff telling you that yet, giving answers to questions like that?
We don't have a paper published on that topic, but I can talk just in general about some unpublished findings, which essentially map on to the informed hypotheses that you just mentioned. So it is true that stressful life experiences that occur before age 18 do tend to be highly impactful, regardless of what health outcome you're talking about. Yeah. But it's also true that adversity before age 18 is not deterministic. Because even people who grew up in crappy circumstances doesn't necessarily mean that they view themselves or the world as crappy. Just like you mentioned, some people who have grown up in relatively negative circumstances are bothered and continue to carry that with them in terms of how they view themselves in the world throughout life. But for many of us, we're also able to persist despite those experiences, and we tend to still have positive experiences of ourselves in our world, even though we were in negative circumstances. So you have to think about it in terms of that sophistication. Early life stress is the most impactful type of life stress that you can experience for health problems as a whole. But I want your listeners to know that we're just talking about risk. And even if you have a high risk, doesn't mean you have those health problems. And in many of the studies we've seen, the way that you think about the world, of course, really matters a lot. So early life stress, and then the second most impactful period of time is right around the time when people tend to retire, about 55 years old to 70 years old. There seems to be another peak where, and this may be also the period of people's lives where they're losing parents. They start to lose loved ones who really mean a lot to them. And also they tend to have huge changes in their own personal lives and roles. So people tend to retire. They tend to have kids who might go off to college. They might have parents who, as I mentioned, pass away or start to have severe health problems, or they may become caregivers, somebody else who needs their help. And so that tends to be another peak in people's lives around 55, I would say, to 65 or 70 years old, where stress again becomes highly impactful in terms of shaping people's health outcomes.
And that hasn't been published. It's just something you've seen in the data so far.
Yeah, and one of the reasons we haven't published it is because we've seen that across a lot of different health problems.
Yeah.
We've seen that in a few studies of ovarian and breast cancer, another study of cognitive aging. And of course, before we come out and say that that pattern is really true, we really want to understand if those periods of time are kind of risk factors, regardless of what health outcome it is that you're talking about. I mean, is it just something about that specific disorder, for example, which would also be interesting, but it'd be a different story? Or is it something that really that period of time is just critical for shaping all kinds of health outcomes, regardless of the specific biology of those health outcomes,
Yeah.
In other words, is it sort of a common and universal risk factor to experience stress during those periods of time, in which case, that would be really important for us to know about.
My feeling is, it's not my feeling, this is sort of parroting what I've read from others, but certainly there's a gentleman named William Thomas who has the model of sort of lifespan, and he's got this concept of you move from childhood to adulthood, and we've all sort of socially accepted the awkwardness of adolescence. That's just a time that kids are taking more risk. It's just a whole set of behaviors in this country, in this continent, really, in the Western world in general, a sense of what happens. That terrain is kind of mapped pretty well in terms of adolescence, and it's difficult to parent at that time typically. But what we have not done such a good job languaging and mapping is this, what you're describing is sort of the other side of the mountain, which is the period going from kind of middle adulthood, working years, et cetera, into kind of elderhood, was his words, this senescent period. In Dr. Thomas's theory, it can be in some ways equally as awkward for all the reasons that you mentioned: losing parents, empty nest, loss of identity of, like a work identity. There's so many different unique experiences of that period of time. So it's interesting that you're seeing it play out when you quantify stress. That's fascinating.
Yeah, we do find that. And let me broaden the picture and say, I think the problem is even bigger than that in the westernized world. The problem really with how we view stress in the States is that we think of it as a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
If you say you're stressed out, it's not negative. It's positive. It means that you're trying hard. It means you're working. It means you're striving toward the American dream. And I can say we have a somewhat to very sick view of stress if you think about it like that. In other words, saying that you're stressed out people don't say, oh, well, you should really take care of that. Why don't you change your job? Why don't you go on a vacation? What can I do? Let me do some work for you. That's just not how we view it. Stress is part of the culture, striving for the quote unquote American dream, being stressed out. Those are all things that we say, not because we're not stressed out. We definitely are, but we wear those things in our culture more as a badge of honor than other countries do. And so, of course, in order to realize that you have a problem, you first got to recognize that that problem is true. And I think that's the real issue with stress in the American society, if I can make generalization, which is that we just don't view it as something to be avoided. We view it as something to move toward. And we do that even though now most of us are aware that stress can degrade health over time.
Yeah, this is such a great point. Dale Bredesen, who's a guest and he's a teacher and mentor of mine, he has in his book, The End of Alzheimer's, has a chapter or two on if you could create dementia, if you could, cause dementia in somebody, what would you do? Well, you'd like garbage every day and you wouldn't sleep enough and you'd have chronic stress and, et cetera, drink too much alcohol and smoke, you know what I mean? So one thing after another. And, I think to a certain degree on the dietary side, have pretty good data. Smoking and kind of other environmental toxins, we have a fairly good sense, but it's work like yours that is now, I think, really giving us the scientific basis on a deep level with some of the transcriptomic studies that you described earlier to have more informed conversations, hopefully in midlife and really, obviously, hopefully in young, kind of in childhood, really, to sort of change the landscape, the culturescape, as you were describing. But I really, really appreciate the work that you're doing, Dr. Slavich, and taking the time to spend with us today. We'd love to have you back at some point as well.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. I just want to leave your listeners with the idea that, if you go in, just as you said, thinking that your diet is out of whack and you go in and you have your doctor might ask you to write down everything that you ate every day. Or if you go in and you tell them that you're fatigued, they may look at your sleep or give you a sleep monitor or something of that sort. In order to take the first step to do something about your stress, you do have to measure it. Your listeners can go to the website, lifestresstest.com. They can take the strain for themselves. If reducing stress is something that is important for them, then you got to measure it first. You got to tell your doctor about it, just like you would do with diet or sleep or any other risk factor that you mentioned. It measure it first and then take action. So lifestresstest.com, they can take the strain themselves, they can get their readout and take the first step toward living a more healthy and happy lifestyle.
That's excellent. Lifestresstest.com. We'll, of course, put that in the show notes, and we'll put some other websites where people can learn about your work. Thank you so much, George. Really appreciate the time.
My pleasure as well, and thank you.
So that's our episode. I hope you guys got something out of that. Check the show notes out on iTunes or on our website where we've summarized the key points. If you have questions or comments or just want to connect, please check us out on our Facebook page. Or if you're old-fashioned like me, Google Evolving Past Alzheimer's Podcast, and you'll find us that way. Finally, if you find the information here valuable, please consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes and leaving comments in the comments section. It will really help us bring this message to as many people as we can. Thanks, and talk to you next time.